Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to my new version of Tempo Wisdom. So, for anyone who doesn't know, about 4 months ago, me and Senelion developed a Tempo Wisdom deck, Mono Wisdom, and the idea was a Mono Wisdom aggro mid-rangey thing. It was quite a fun deck to play, one of my favorite decks to play of all time, and I've played more Tempo Wisdom than anyone else, pretty much ever. So, the thing about being the only person that plays an archetype is it means that when you're not playing it, it doesn't advance very fast. So I go in bursts of playing Tempo Wisdom. So the original Tempo Wisdom deck I made a deck of. Then I had a second version, which was after Force Wielder and Thermic Laboratory got buffed. So I tried that out, and it was not very good, because the metagame wasn't very conducive to it. And the deck never really got above low tier 2, probably tier 3. So it was unique, but it didn't really work. Then with this balance patch, I thought, let's give a bash at it again. Probably won't be very good, but let's try it. So I put an unstable reactor in, because I tried unstable reactor before, and I was thinking it was bad, because it always wiped my own board, but I liked it, but it just wasn't very good. And I thought, how do I protect my own board? I know, forcefield. Yes, I'm playing forcefield, and as a 4 of. And it's very good. It is very, very good. It blocks so much damage. It will, on average, probably block about 10 damage in a game or more. And it's so, so powerful. The fact that it protects your board from unstable reactor is just amazing. It allows you to play a one-sided board sweeper in blue, which is a big, big deal. And I will say, Force Field's always been one of those cards people just assume is bad, but in reality, I think we've given it a bit of a bad rap. I think it's actually quite powerful. And this kind of deck has a dual nature to it. In the early game, it's a standard aggro deck with some combo-y nature to it with the energy side of it. And then the late game, it actually transitions into a control deck using lamps to attack and force field and stable reactor to lock down the board. So in the early game, you play the aggro side of things. Then in the late game, your job is quite literally to lock your opponent out of the game entirely. Now, the only problem with a dual nature phase like this is that in a lot of decks you have issues where you just draw a lot of your stuff in the early game that you don't want, and you draw your bad cards late game. However, in this deck, because of the way the deck operates, there's only probably 2 cards in the deck that are bad late game, and the only cards you don't want to draw early are Lamp and Force Field, really. That's about it. So it's not as clunky, considering it does have a late game nature to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the energy cards that are payoffs, and then we're going to talk about the energy manipulation, and then just the solid cards in the deck in general that kind of hold everything together. So we already talked about Force Field a bit. It's premium against Order and also Rage. Rage can't deal with Force Field. It's kind of hilarious. It negates Fire Blast. 2 Force Fields negate Advanced Zash's ability, more or less. All of their fireballs stop killing your lamps. Word of Fire becomes close to useless. It's kind of hilarious how bad it is to Force Field. Even things like Fia. Fia can't damage through a Force Field, and it needs to have 2 energy to deal 1. Fia is hilariously bad against Force Field. It's quite funny. So yeah, Force Field's an amazing card against Rage. It always has been. And against Order, it blocks all the militia. And it means that the Dwarf Musketeers don't trade with your golems, which is pretty big, actually. On top of that, a second one will actually, like, if you have 2 force fields out at once, which does happen, you can actually fully negate a soldier board sometimes, where they can have 20 attack on their board and only hit you for, like, 5, because everything's a 2-2. So it is very good against 2 of the best decks in the game right now, which is one of the reasons I tried Force Field, and it started as a 2 of, and it's now a 4 of. Then we've got the 2 staples of Tempo Wisdom. Force Mage Protector, one of the best creatures in the game, with the shields that make everyone's life miserable. Yeah, shields are a pain in the neck to play against. Now, the card itself will usually either help something trade or just not trade. It will protect it from being traded with, or it will completely ruin a red player's day. This deck is very, very good against red in general. And against soldiers, it also has a lot of extra tech against it. So I really like this deck in the current metagame. Now, before we move on, I just want to talk about Force Mage Protector and how to use the shield. Because even some very good players get this wrong, and it's irritating. So with Force Mage Protector, you shield ahead of time on your turn if you're against red. You shield your most important creature. If you're against corruption, you shield something with 3 life to avoid noxious fumes. Or you just shield something important so that they can't sacrifice it, because you just sacrifice your protector instead and you don't lose any value. Against Dominion, you put the shield on a lamp because it can't get assassinated. Against Nature, you leave 1 shield up on the protector to threaten it so that they have to bounce it, but if you have 4 energy, you use one of the shields so you don't get blown out. Against Order, you use the shield before attacking. And against... against Rage, you shield. Against Nature, you have to split the shields as much as possible. Against Order, just before attacking, and on defense, it's always the same. Against Wisdom, it's a lost color. Against Wisdom, you only shield 1 HP stuff against Advanced Darius, or if you know, they're playing Flash Freeze. That is the handbook for using Protector. Learn it, live it, love it if you're playing Protector, because it's absurd how many people get that wrong. It's actually, it's not the easiest thing to kind of like... It's a logical way of doing it, but you kind of need to think about it in the first place. So some of them, like the bounce thing, are less obvious. But basically, don't misplay Protector. You just follow those rules, and it's fine. That's how Protector works. The other big payoff is Foundry Engineers. Now, Foundry Engineers is a win condition. Yep. In the early game, you play them, and if they don't have removal, you just generate golems every other turn. In the late game, you play them, generate 4 golems at once with all the energy manipulation, and go absolutely nuts. It also works with Unstable Reactor by setting it off very fast, which is normally a bad thing, but because of Force Field, it becomes a good thing, because it means you can set off the reactor whenever you like, which is a pretty big deal. So Foundry Engineer is one of my favorite cards in the game, and I always liked making golems, so any excuse I have to make golems, I will take. Now, I'm talking about Reactor last. The reason for it is because it fits into both categories. It's both a payoff and a supplier with energy. So, first of all, it generates 1 energy per turn, and you can transfer this energy off to anything. It even starts with 1 energy, so you can transfer it immediately, which is very, very handy. It works with Force Field primarily, but also with Foundry Engineers, the 2 big ones, and Force Mage Protector over 2 turns. So, Unstable Reactor works in that regard. It also works with Charged Aurite by matching up the damage from the Aurite. You can also charge up your Aurite ahead of time, because if you think about it, you're actually gaining energy out of that, because the Reactor can only transfer once per turn. So you might as well just transfer it onto the Aurite and then transfer that onto something. Now, the payoff is that when it gets to 6 energy, you have an AoE. Which Wisdom does not normally have. So you have this AoE from Reactor, it's a big deal, it works against soldiers, it wipes the soldier's board basically with 1 flash freeze. You just flash freeze the tactician, and the Reactor goes off and wipes his board out. And people outside. And against Rage, it wipes the board clean, completely, more or less. So Reactor is very, very powerful in this kind of deck, and I'm very, very happy with it. On top of that, you can play around artifact removal with Force Wielder. You can play Reactor on turn 6 with a Force Wielder on the board and just pump it with 4 mana, and immediately it goes off. So yeah, well, I mean, you have to end your turn, then it gets the 6 energy. But the point is, you can kind of surprise people with it, unless they have like, can they even respond to it? No, I don't think they can at the end of turn. So as long as you skip combat, they can't even respond to it. So yeah, the Reactor is very, very powerful in that regard. So it bridges the gap between energy manipulation and energy payoff. On to the energy manipulation, the smallest of them, the Charged Aurite. The tiny, tiny Charged Aurite. Surprisingly packs a lot of punch for a 1-drop. Now, the thing about Charged Aurite is ever since its energy got reduced to 0 from 1, which was probably unnecessary, it hasn't seen any play. It's always been quite bad. Now, the reason it's in this deck in particular is twofold. First of all, it works best with Protector and kind of with Foundry Engineers, although with Reactor and Charged Aurite openings you can get Foundry Engineers to work. And the main reason is actually the 1/1 flyer that has a relevant ability is surprisingly good in this deck. I think the reason for it is because Reactor Aurite does 3 damage to something, which is relevant, and it also means you can use it with Force Field to just block all day and to kill Militia. That's a big deal. It also trades with the Goblins early game, which is also a big deal. You can play Charged Aurite into Spark Protector, attack a Goblin, shield it immediately, and get the free one there. Also works against Sharpshooter. You can block Sharpshooters early, and if you shield it, it goes straight through. This deck does not play Disquisitive Spirit anymore, which means that Charged Aura becomes even more important. Not important enough to play 4, but important. Now, the other 3-0 for the early game is Force Wielder. Now, Force Wielder, ever since it became a 2-drop, has been relevant in Wisdom, at least in Mono Wisdom, and the energy transferability from mana is something which Stomach Laboratory has as well, but Force Wielder does not have a cooldown. You can also play it from hand for 6 mana and transfer 4 immediately. That comes up late game a lot with Force Fields. If you put 4 mana onto a Force Field, it stays there for 4 turns, which means that if you have a couple Force Wielders, you can actually keep Force Fields up permanently in the late game, and it makes this deck a nightmare to deal with in the late game. But Force Wielder is always a card that looks like it could do something powerful, but never really works, and in this deck, it actually does work for once, which is nice. On to the last of the, creatures and that can make energy, kind of. It's Gnome Power Engineer. Now, Gnome Power Engineer is not in the deck to make energy. It's in the deck to deal with spells and artifacts that you kind of need. The side effect of it, though, actually makes up for its downfall against Unicorn. It has 1 less speed, 1 less HP, but in this particular deck, nowhere else, but in this particular deck, the energy transfer is absolutely amazing, because it usually turns into 2 or 3 turns on a force field, a reactor wiping the board, 2 golems, a shield. It's just amazing value out of this guy, and I'm very, very happy with him. Not enough spells and artifacts to run more than 2, but the 2 have been fairly handy. Then, lastly, we have the Thaumic Laboratory, which is actually the most useful energy manipulation in the deck. The reason for it is because it's a shrine, which means you can't get rid of it. As soon as they have it, and you can't get rid of hero abilities, which means you have a permanent way of dishing out energy every other turn. Now, the way that the cooldown works, being 2 turns, means that it will keep a force field going permanently, since it's effectively 1 energy per turn, and you only need to spend 2 mana on it every other turn to keep a force field going permanently. It's one of the reasons why in the late game you actually never run out of things to do with your mana, which does come up a bit with Golem being 1 cost instead of 2, is that you have an extra mana late game, which is fairly relevant since this deck has so much stuff to do with its mana. It's kind of hilarious. Now, as for some of the other creatures that just hold the deck together, we've got 4 cards, well, creatures and spell, that hold the deck together in general. First one we got is Golem, which we mentioned, 2-drop. Kind of. It's 1 mana plus 2 levels instead of 2 mana plus 1. It's weird in that regard. But the Golem is just a vanilla 2-2. It's not a good card, but it's okay. If they use artifact removal on it, you're kind of happy, because then the rest of your stuff doesn't die. But it's just a dork. It applies pressure in the early game. It's a decent blocker or attacker. Not spectacular, but it doesn't have to be. It's the same reason why Fireworker is played in Mono-Red. Doesn't have to be an amazing 2-drop, just kind of has to be possible. And that's all Golem has to do, is just be a possible body on the board early game, and it does its job. Library Guards. Library Guards is not a possible card. The Library Guards is one of the best, if not the best creatures in the entire game. 2-3 body trades with pretty much anything you want to, and it doesn't die to your own reactor. 3 speed allows you to hit anything or block anything. It smooths out your draws in the early game. You can top deck at late game and just run them off. It means that you can turn bad hands into good hands beginning second. You can go double on curve. Library Guards is amazing. If you want to hear my entire spiel about Library Guards, go to my top 10 creatures list, where I talk about it for a good 3 or 4 minutes. It's just an amazing card and should never be underestimated, and should be played in every single blue deck as a 4-of. It's absolutely amazing. Then we've got Lamp of Zafir, the control side win condition. So this deck has a habit of translating from an aggro deck in the early game to a control deck in the late game, and part of the reason is Lamp. Lamp is 2 things. 1, it's a mana sink when you need it, and 2, it's a 4-3 with 3 speed and swift for 5 mana. It's absolutely insane against certain aspects. Basically, if you're not playing, if you're playing Corruption, first of all, you just can't beat it. Can't be done. Dominion has some serious issues. They need to basically mind extort it, otherwise they're dead. And Order has Pacify, and that's it. They can't deal with it in any other way. I mean, Wisdom only has Gnome, and I guess their own lamps, but they have mainly just Gnome. I think Nature has probably the most ways of dealing dealing with it. You've got the Unicorn, and also you've got bounce spells that can really irritate the Wisdom player since he sinks all his mana in and then you just bounce it, or you landslide it. That can be really brutal. And lastly, you've got Red. Red normally is good against Lamp, but not when you're playing 4 force fields. When you're playing 4 force fields, nothing kills the Lamp anymore, which means they basically need artifact removal, otherwise the Lamp is never leaving. It's such a powerful win condition and will absolutely smash control decks especially. It's very, very powerful. It also closes out the game fairly quickly. Now, lastly, but certainly not least, we have Flash Freeze. Flash Freeze has always been one of those cards that I've always been on the fence about. However, now I have Reactor in this deck, which means that you can reliably kill large board states with one Flash Freeze and a Reactor. It also means you can kill things like Bloodseeking Mutant a lot more easily with Flash Freeze Reactor, as opposed to just 4 Flash Freeze, was always a bit sketchy. So that's just a nice effect on its own. Also, 1 damage is fairly relevant now. There's a lot of 1 HP stuff. In red, you've got Fia, all the goblins. Like, even Flame Serpent is seeing a ton of play now. And then on the order side of things, you've got Dwarf Musketeer, which is a big deal, by the way, if you hit a Flash Freeze on a Dwarf Musketeer. And on top of that, you've got things that are really, really big and just get smashed by Flash Freeze. Things like Multiple Tacticians, deal with them with a Flash Freeze. You've got the Night Recruiter, very easy to deal with. You've got Unstable Reactor that will wipe the board completely, and you also have Flash Freeze and then just a block. And then it's gone. It doesn't matter how large it is. So this deck has no issue with Night Recruiter because of those two. Now, before we go into the actual games, apparently there's an update. Before we go into the actual games, talk a bit about the hero itself. This is something which I've had an interesting discussion with a couple people about, which is Basic Darius versus Elric. Now, Basic Darius is very, very stable, because it gives you draw power in the late game, and it means if you don't have anything to do with 3 mana, you can just sink your mana whenever you like. It's one of the reasons why this deck never has issues with excess mana. You've got 2 hero powers, Force Wielder, all of these like Lamps late games. You pretty much never run out of things to do with your mana, and Advanced Darius wouldn't really work here, 3 levels, whereas Basic Darius is just amazing. Now, Elric is an interesting one, because Elric works really, really well with Lamp, and also with Library Guards. The problem with Elric is that you need a creature on the board, and he's not very good if you don't have a board state. If you do have a board state, you probably don't need a hero power in this deck. So if you do have a board state, it's probably because he can't do anything. And if you don't have a board state, that's when you need your hero power the most, which is why I like the basic Darius ability. And of course, lastly, for card backs, you need to run the Mono Wisdom card back. I mean, you're playing a mono deck. You need to represent with the Mono Wisdom card back. I mean, we've got like the Mono Rage card back for red, and you've got the Mono Wisdom card back for the blue. So anyway, we're going to try out a game or 2. Now, for this deck tech, depending on the quality of the first game, I'll either do 1 or 2 games. But for deck techs in general, I actually want to ask about this. What would you guys prefer? What I've been doing normally, which has been like 10 to 15 minutes of deck tech, followed by 1 game as an example, or would you prefer a 15-minute deck tech minimum, followed by 1, maybe even 2 games? So the real difference is a half-an-hour deck tech video versus a 45-minute deck tech video, roughly. But one of them is like harder to just watch in one stint, and the other one gives you less information. So I am curious as to what people prefer. So put that in the comment section below, and I will follow depending on what people actually want. Well, what I want right now is for a queue not to be too long. I'm hoping that's not a thing. Anyway, we do actually have a balance patch coming up soon, which will be nerfing Mutant and probably buffing some stuff. Ivco did mention that Charged Aurite might be reverted. He hinted at the fact that it might be reverted, which would be good for this deck, obviously, but probably warranted, since I think the card is a little underpowered anyway. But in terms of the game balance right now, I'm not too fussed. I think Mutant's a bit too powerful, but that's about it. Like, Soldiers and Red kind of, like, Red counters Soldiers largely. Soldiers counters a lot of other stuff, but then you've got some Elf decks running around. I think that Mono Wisdom is fine. With Wisdom Dominion, which is okay, unless you're against Soldiers. And then you've got the 1-turn heal deck randomly around, so I think the balance is fine. It's not perfect, obviously, but it's possible right now, and I think a lot of it is just that people aren't trying new decks, and it's more about the fact that everyone just sees what decks win and then copies them. And I think that is what has caused the whole stagnation period we have right now. But anyway, as far as the rest of the stuff goes, we should be getting a tournament and also a spectator mode with this patch, if I recall, which would be very good because it means I could maybe do some casting as a video series. You know, I'm actually thinking of doing that. If there's a spectator mode that works, I am thinking of doing some casting of like some of the matches of my teammates, since like I do have the privilege of being on a team with some of the best players in Spellweaver, so I could just spectate some of them with their permission, obviously. I could spectate some of them and cast over their matches on ladder, since I think some people would actually enjoy watching that. As we have finally found a game. That was a long queue. That may have actually been the longest queue I've ever had on a video. We're going to keep this hand. It's got 2-drop into Protector, and that can Library Guards. It's a good hand. But anyway, there's a couple video days, as I said, coming up. Like with Spectator mode, I might use Spectator mode to do a video series. We'll see. And with the balance, I mean, I'll do a meta report at the end of the month. At the end of this monthly balance thing, like I normally do, just to see how it changes from month to month. But besides that, we'll just have to see what the balance patch actually is and then go from there. Now, he is playing Corruption Dominion, which means I should be very heavily favored. This is a very, very good matchup for me because I have access to so many spells and artifacts. So we'll see what he does. Assassinate? No, assassin. Fumes. Yeah. I was like, assassinate? Nah, that's assassin fumes. Alright, that's annoying. Go Library Guards, move back because I've got Force Field in hand that he can't interact with, which means that I can use the Force Field to scare off the assassin, since the assassin will no longer deal damage. And if it doesn't deal damage, it's not deadly anymore. Oh, a bit tired. I do have the issue right now where I can't keep the Force Field going. I don't have any energy manipulation anymore, since he removed my Force Wielder earlier. Removing Force Wielder on curve is very important, because otherwise, if you don't, and then you remove the next thing they play, and then you remove the next thing they play, and they just keep transferring energy, and it's miserable. Devious Plot. Well, now that I know he's got it. Okay, the Force Wielder pickup is a big deal. Atomic Laboratory. Alright, that was a very, very good set of draws there. Now I've got Atomic Laboratory to keep it going. I've also got Force Wielder that I can just play and transfer 3 energy immediately. I think what I might do is play Charged Alright, and then probably Atomic Laboratory. I'm expecting this to get Devious Plotted, since he showed the Devious Plot earlier. That does not deal damage. This catches a lot of people off, by the way. People forget about Force Field. This has happened so many times. It's actually kind of shocking how few people remember a Force Field is on the board. Yeah, no, it's the Devious Plot. That was a very, very cost-efficient library cards. Alright, so I'm just going to play Charged Alright, and then play the Force Wielder, use the energy while I can, and I'm actually going to save the Atomic Laboratory trigger, since I just want to make use of my mana. Like, if I use Atomic Laboratory, I can't actually make use of my mana, which is a bit awkward. I'm going to get rid of this No Power Engineer, and miss anyway, so it doesn't matter. I could use it on a Helm, which is very powerful, because if he steals your Foundry, you can actually take out the Helm and transfer 4 energy onto the same Foundry, which is just ludicrous. But I don't think I'm that scared of Helm. I'm not that scared of anything you can play, actually, now I think about it. I'm not scared of... what? Restless Tombs, I guess, would be the worst? And I don't even think that's very good. I'm just going to start pumping onto this Charged Alright, so he's forced to deal with it. Because if he doesn't deal with it, then I'm just going to stack a bunch of energy on Foundry Engineers and force him to Cataclysm if he has a Cataclysm. Transferring that 2 energy onto the force field means I don't have to for a couple of turns, which is actually a fairly big tempo boost in the other turns. If he doesn't kill this charged aura, then that's really big for me. I'm just going to make 3 golems. Then I'm actually going to buff up the force field instead. And I'm going to force him to Cataclysm by putting an extra card into the board. I think he had to anyway. Maybe I shouldn't have played the golem. Yeah, this deck is actually not as easy to play as some of the old Tempo Wisdom decks. Tempo Wisdom has never been that easy to play anyway. Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. Tempo Wisdom has never been that easy of a deck to play in the first place, but this version's much harder because Unstable Reactor, Force Field actually mess up your own math quite a bit. So you need to count the artifacts carefully, otherwise you'll screw yourself over with Reactor. And with Force Field, it makes combat math really hard, both for you and for your opponent, because you can make attacks that normally would be suicide. Oh wow, he looked at top 7. He looked at top 7 and only got 2. But yeah, I'll probably play a second game for this stream then. I mean, not for this stream. I'm so used to streaming. At this point, for this video, I'll probably play a second game then. Since this one seems to be in the bag a bit with this force field. There's the reactor. The reactor goes off immediately. Actually, I can just make the reactor go off, like, now, I think. Right, can I? What could I do here? So I can actually save this reactor for 1 turn. Wait, no, if I do it this way, this blocks 2 damage. It's weird how this works sometimes. That blocks 2 damage because of the force field. Midnight Cravings. Alright, that's a card I didn't think I'd see. I haven't seen a Midnight Cravings, like, ever, I think. So it gains 4 energy, which means I can make a golem safely. Yeah, I want to get an extra golem out just in case he removes the foundry, but I do not want this to go off. Not because it would wipe my board, but simply because I'd rather it be able to be set off whenever I like. Because if he plays a couple of creatures now, I can actually just flash freeze and trigger my reactor. Oh, there's a lamp. I should have made golems end of turn, that was a mistake. I mean, this is lethal if he just passes. Yeah, it does. So that was a bit of a whitewash of a game, so I'm just going to play a second one for this particular video. If I can find one, that is, since that first queue time was actually quite long. I'm not used to friendlies being quite long with queue times. They're normally about 30 seconds, which isn't too bad. I've had to record this video a few times because I messed up a few things technical-wise. I left my microphone off for one of them, and then for another one, both games were atrocious. Like, I had people that just conceded immediately. Like, on turn 1, probably because they just got the wrong mulligans or something like that. But, yeah. Oh no, I am fairly happy with that, although I am a bit worried about the way it ended up playing out, because I feel like I've made a creature-based version of one-turn heal. At this stage, because late game it does get a bit silly with force field. If you get multiple force fields out, you start locking your opponent out of the game entirely. I played against a Corruption Dominion deck on stream today, and I had 2 force fields on with a lamp, and every single card in his deck was pointless. Like, no card in his deck did anything. Like, because I didn't have any creatures for any of his removal, and all of his creatures had 2 or less attack. So none of his, no card in his entire deck did anything. it was quite baffling. It was just a slow death at that point. Not being able to kill a lamp and not being able to damage your opponent is fairly brutal. But anyway, as for some of the other stuff that's coming out recently, not recently, in the future with Spellweaver, we haven't heard any more word about the ranking system. I actually prefer the current ranking system over what it was a month ago, which is weird because I think it's the same ranking system, but it seems to work differently. Like, it seems like the points you're gaining or losing at one time are much lower than they used to be. But anyway, there was a suggestion for a different ranking system by one of the devs, actually, and we haven't heard anything about that. That was about a month ago. No, for this hand, I don't like this hand. There's not quite enough anti-aggro stuff. This is better, especially considering he doesn't have a 1-drop. Yeah, this is better. I can go Force Wielder, especially if he's playing a bit more defensively, because Force Field is absolutely insane. Let's just go for a Force Wielder, and then I can maybe play Library Guards next turn. Yeah, I'm just going to play Library Guards. I don't need a Force Field yet. Library Guards with Spark is too powerful when my opponent's playing on the removal strat. This matchup is miserable for Rage, because all of his removal is damage-based, and the longer this game goes, the worse it gets for him, is the thing. Like, it definitely does not get better. I'm just going to play out a lamp here, because if he keeps using removal on my stuff, I'm actually happy, because it means it gives me time to set up my force fields. I think I just set up a force field here and pause. Atomic Laboratory, which is useful for the force field. Next turn, I think I just go force field reactor and start draining energy onto the force fields. Just one force field is hard to deal with red, let alone two. Like, this board state normally represents 10 attack. I mean, not 10, 8 attack, and it's now 3. Because the Fia does effectively 2 damage per turn. So he just dealt 3 damage with that. Oh, another thing it doesn't do. Oh, no. I would not be surprised if he conceded immediately. I would instantly concede if someone played a second force field against me and I'm playing red. Because he actually can't deal damage with his current board. His board deals nothing. To give you an idea of how insane force field is against red, his current board would normally have, what, 14 attack on it? No. It's the immortality ring. Yep, completely immortal against red. Even Dragonfire does 3. He may just instantly concede, because there's like nothing he can do. Well, time for the Foundry Engineers that can't be killed. You need to Dragonfire this now. Like, he legitimately needs a Dragonfire to kill that Foundry Engineers currently. Which is a lot to ask. But if he has a Dragonfire, he has to use it. And then as soon as the reactor goes off, everything dies. So he's going to get rid of the reactor. That's fine. The force fields are still in place, and I can use Force Wielder to compensate for reactor not being there anymore. I can just start pumping energy onto these force fields. The funny thing is, I can't really end the game very fast. I could end it in 5 turns, I guess, with Lamp. I would have actually probably killed the Lamp, because the reactor is going to go off at some point anyway. Alright, so I've got 5 mana. So I think I'm just going to pump 4 energy onto one of these. And go from there. I'm going to start moving stuff forward because this foundry is completely immortal because every single attacker into it gets reduced by 2. So nothing on his board damages it. That's a dragon fire a force wielder. That's not something I've seen for a while, but I put 4 energy onto a force field. So that force field's going to stay there for a long time. Now he has to move back because none of these can damage anything. This is how bad it is to play against mono blue with red. It is this miserable. I'm keeping a force field up here in my hand. Just oh wow, I've got more than I thought I did. And he just concedes. There was nothing he can do. I'm actually kind of happy I got that on video. It just shows how disgusting force field is against red. Like red in particular. Force field blocked like 30 damage or something in that game. It blocked a colossal amount of damage. Like 2 force fields, the game ends. I said it in the deck itself, but 2 force fields and the game is completely over. Like, he can't interact with them, they never leave, and all of his removal is damage-based, which means that I had a Foundry Engineers that was basically completely immortal. Like, he could Dragonfire it, but then he had to Dragonfire my Force Wielder, because the Force Wielder is keeping my Force Field up. So it's a lock against red, and there's just nothing I can do about it. But anyway, that's my updated Tempo Wisdom deck tech. So, thank you for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback or ask me any questions about the deck, put it in the comment section below. I will put a screenshot of the actual deck in the description as usual, just so you can refer to it more easily. But as now, it's been Jotto, signing off.